So in the start, I have told you that we are actually creating this server to provide many features and services to us, like authenticating the user, signing up the user, and all these things. When actually happening in the application, we're going to have to manipulate and process it via the server. For example, if a user try to log in into the application, then the username and password should be manipulated and processed. So the server is able to process that username and password, and then it makes it available to the user, that whether that username and password is available in the database or not. And similarly is the case with sign up and sending message and all these things. So let's get started. I'm going to create a switch statement, and then we provide the action, so that if that action, like for example, if the user want to sign up, so it is also an action. If the user want to log in, it is also an action. So if any one of the action matches with the case statements, then we're going to execute that case statement. So I'm going to create a switch statement in here and provide an action as its passing parameter. Then I'm going to provide a case like authenticate user and break. I'm going to provide a case sign up user and break, and then case send message and break. So I'm just going to provide inside this case statement a code that if the action, like for example, if a user want to log in, then it's going to match with the authenticate user, and then we're going to execute the specific amount of code in here. So for that purpose, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to write the authenticate user code. In the meanwhile, I'm going to pause the video, and then it would come back with the explanation of that code. So now I have provided actually the code of the authenticate user in here, and I've written it. Now in the first line at 40, I've written an if statement. And I'm saying that if the user ID variable is equal to authenticate user, which actually passing the database username and password parameters, then do the following kind of code. So what is authenticate user? It is actually a custom method which we're going to be creating later on in the server in this index.php with the parameters of db username and password. And the function of authenticate user is this, that it's going to check out the username and password, that whether they are present inside the database or not. So if the user ID is present inside the database, so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to create a variable called SQL, and then you're going to have to choose the user ID and username and plus user IP plus provider ID, request ID, status whether online or not, user port from the table friends, and then it will be left join with the users and provided with the ID of user ID. So what does left join do? Left join is actually putting and taking all the rows from the left table, that is actually the table F, and then putting all the rows from the U table that actually matches with the table of F. So it is actually the right table, it is actually the left table. So all the rows which has been taken, if matches any one of them with the U table that is on the right side, then we're going to be calling it a left join. So on the user ID, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to provide actually if statement that if the provider ID is equal to user ID, that means that if a person who is sending the request is actually the provider, and it matches and the user ID is present in there, and as well as the request ID and the provider ID is also given. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to actually provide the you're going to have to set out the user ID to provider ID, and the status should be unapproved, user approved, which means that the user would be actually allowed and would be added into the list of the another user. For example, if demo 1 is actually send a request to demo 2, then the provider ID is actually given in here, so that is actually demo 1. The request ID and all these things are given in here, so all the details are meshed up, so the user would be actually approved in any way in that case. So after doing this, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to create an SQL message variable, and in that SQL message variable select the MID, which is actually the index ID. And this is actually M from ID. M from ID means that the ID of that person who is sending the request, and that is actually to UID, the ID of that person who is receiving the request. And send DT means send date, which is actually the ID of that, or you can call it the date upon which the request is being sent. So the read ID, the read key also, and read date plus message text username from messages. So messages is also a table, and we are actually selecting all these rows from the messages table, as we have already created these rows in the previous videos. And then what we are going is we are actually left joining it with the users table on the ID of, like we are actually left joining it those IDs, those rows with from ID and to ID. And then we are actually concatenating it with the help of and providing a limit of 0 to 30. Now I've added another if statement, and I've created a variable result, which is actually we're going to be passing out this query inside the result. I'm just actually calling out the query function, and we are with the help of database variable. So it will be like a kind of db.query. SQL would be passed in there, and this would be in Java syntax. So db query, we are actually passing on and calling the query function and passing on the parameter of SQL inside that query to execute this SQL command, this SQL string which we have placed inside the SQL variable. So for that purpose we're going to have to provide this query. So if it is executed, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to provide a while loop, and then we're going to have to actually loop through each row object. So by looping through each user object, what we're going to have to use is the built-in fetch object method. So the built-in fetch object method would actually take on this result in here. So what the result is having is actually an SQL variable which contains all these provider ID, request ID, and all these things. So we are actually getting a hold of these rows via a result variable. So in here, when we grab the result variable by fetching it, then we are looping through each variable, we are looping through user ID, username, user IP in here. Then we're going to be checking out that the status at first by default is offline. So if the row status is equal to the user unapproved, as we have already discussed in here, so the user would be actually unapproved, which means that he would not be actually accepted. But if the authenticate time difference is less than the time interval for user status, which means that if the user time interval for which the user has been waiting for, or a kind of break or a kind of time is given for a user status is greater than the time difference of authentication in which the user is trying to log in on, then it will be actually, the status will be changed to online. And then we're going to be actually outputting the friend username by getting a row username by calling a row username, and a status by getting a status of it, plus the IP, the row user key with the user key means the index of the row, that is actually the starting index of the row, and plus port, which is actually by itself nothing but a row port in here. And then at the last, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create another variable result message, and then we're going to pass on this SQL message where we are actually selecting the rows from the tables and then left joining it with the user table, and then we're going to pass it on in here and we're going to also execute that one. And once again we're going to loop through each and every row like MID from UID to UID in here with the help of while loop, and then we're going to output the message that who is sending the message. So message from the person who is sending the message with the username in here, and send text would be actually that would be a send text, and it would be taken out from a database, and a text actually by itself. And then what we would have is, and actually we're gonna have to then update the database, because then the next user are gonna have to write something in there. So for that we're gonna have to update the database. So SQL in message would actually update the messages and would set the read to 1, which means that writing is available now. And then we're gonna read the date within this format, like year, month and date, with hour and minute, seconds, and where the messages would be with the ID of the raw messages. And in that case, then we're going to execute the SQL in message, and that would be, then we're going to be able to fetch out and authenticate our user.